even though we don't have that going on now, it doesn't mean that there's equity or that people don't continue to have a post-slavery system of experience of feeling unequal. And what does that do to that individual over time? So we've been looking at it, and it creates a situation of like this brewing inflammation in their life to have to address these things. And so positive community, like having places where you can de-stress, you can talk through those things, not accepting certain forms of mistreatment, not normalizing it or holding it in, yoga, stretching, prayer, meditation, like things that like bring you joy, like creating opportunities for joy to counter that stuff.
Welcome back to the Holistic OBGYN podcast, everybody. As you can imagine, based on my position on home birth and what the medical industrial complex would consider high-risk births like multiples or breech, along with my support nationally for midwives, I don't have a ton of OBGYNs with whom I could break bread. A lot of OBGYNs think I'm a little heretical, considering especially that I had a home birth myself with my wife in our second pregnancy. And that has made it very lonely for me. But my guest today is an exception. Kia Lanneman is an MD. She is an OBGYN, and then she extended her training through fellowship as a high-risk OBGYN, meaning she's a maternal fetal medicine specialist. And she and I connected on the social media waves due to her, I don't know, open-mindedness, open-heartedness to home birth. One of her family members had a home birth, if I recall, and she was really compelled by this. You know, it really forced her, being a very open-minded person herself, which we get into in the podcast. It forced her to really consider, man, you know, maybe a lot of women can give birth at home. And, you know, she could have had these notions, you know, well established in residency. But when you go through 4 years of hard training, you start to buy into this characterization of home birth as unsafe, irresponsible, uninformed, all of those things. And frankly, once you kind of have to see it in order to believe it. And so when I was in residency, as you may know, I started attending home births. My first was with Stu Fishbein and Bliss Young when she was still an apprentice. They have an amazing podcast as well called Birthing Instincts. Probably like my favorite birth related podcast, because of this podcast, of course, is not just about birth. It gets into parenting and fatherhood and care of the newborn and some of the less physical data aspects of this process. But their podcast is amazing. And so when I started going to home births, I remember going back to my wife and saying, man, I'm really inspired to do this work. And I just have to get through residency. And of course I did. And I became board certified and all that stuff, did a fellowship, not in MFM, but in hospice and palliative care. And I found myself in a very interesting position a couple of years ago to do home birth myself. But had I not had those original influences from people like Dr. Stu and some other incredible midwives along the way, I never would have seen it as a viable option for so many women. And nowadays, I think probably upwards of 80 to 85% of women are probably really, really well suited in the home. Of course, there's reasons to have hospitals and operating rooms, reasons to have a pharmacy and a blood bank on site, and there's reasons to have high-risk OBs. But are we overutilizing these resources? And that's really what our conversation today between me and Dr. Lanneman is all about. So Kia shares with me, you know, some of her insights. What I did is I pulled my Instagram community, which is 25,000 deep now, and I got a lot of really interesting questions around the use of ultrasound and around growth restriction and, you know, uterine artery Dopplers, Doppler velocimetry, But then we also get into prenatal nutrition. And what I love about Kia is that I could go out and have a beer with her. Well, she wouldn't drink beer, as you find out in the episode, but I could go out and have a drink with her and we can disagree, and that's okay. And I think prenatal vitamins is one of those things we sort of disagree on. And that's because there's not a lot of data to support methylfolate, although there's plenty of data to support this notion that folic acid is potentially doing some harm in certain women who are unable to metabolize it, if not all women being relatively unable to metabolize it. And yet folic acid is what you find in most mainstream prenatal vitamins. It's fortified in our cereals and all this other junk food that we call, it's not really food, it's junk processed crap. But, confronting some of these long held dogmas is actually a part of the scientific process. And that's why I feel very, very, very much in admiration of Dr. Lanneman. And I think you're going to really, really love this conversation. So, of course, in order to keep the lights on here, we have a couple of sponsors. Immune Intel AHCC is a product I'm using in my gynecology practice for women who have underlying immune dysfunction, whether it's endometriosis or a clear autoimmune condition, or they've got persistent HPV. I've started utilizing active hexose correlated compound, and it works like a charm. Now, it's just an acute phase treatment, but it can help bridge you to a space where you actually are in the clear from a screening standpoint, whether it's an abnormal pap or a persistent positive HPV screen, while you're getting your other lifestyle factors dialed in. If you want to try this product, go to themedicine.com. That's medicine without the E at the end. THEMEDICIN.com. Use code beloved10. You'll save 10%. If you are dealing with HPV, grab a bottle, grab 2, grab 3, go as high dose as you can tolerate. There's no known toxicity level. They've given rats like their body weight in this stuff, and it hasn't shown any toxicities. As far as we know, it's safe in pregnancy. This could be a part of your radical reclamation of your health. And if you want additional support, Mimi Lindquist, the woman who has helped to make this formulation available to the masses, she and I have a program called Clear and Free. If you want to learn more about that, go to clearhpv.com. We talk about everything, and even the controversial stuff like vaccines and this whole notion that HPV causes cervical cancer. We get into all of that at length, and we provide you a very, very supportive program in order to reclaim your health in the process. So Immune Intel AHCC, thank you for continuing to support the show. I will always support this product because it works so well. And that's all that I really need to know. It's working for my clients, and therefore I'm going to keep doing it until I have information that suggests otherwise. This episode was also made possible by WeNatal. It's my favorite prenatal vitamin on the market. You can go to the grocery store and you will not find something like WeNatal. And there's a lot of good, maybe lesser known vitamins out there that are not being sold in Whole Foods or Sprouts. And WeNatal is one of them. But of all of them, I like WeNatal the best because they're very, very thoughtful about how environmentally unconscious companies are becoming with their packaging. So whenever you go to wenatal.com/beloved, put the prenatal vitamins into your cart. They make a his and her vitamin. They also make a fish oil. If you add a his or her vitamin, subscribe, whatever you want to do, you're going to need to support your body for at least 6 to 12 months before you get pregnant to make sure you have adequate nourishment to grow the healthiest baby and placenta and have the childbirth of your dreams. But they're going to throw in a free bottle of Omega DHA Plus as a listener of the show. And what you're going to get is glass bottles, and then they'll refill those bottles with little package sleeves. And so the packaging is minimal, and I love that. I love that about them. They also will include a journal because they're invested in this mind-body connection as they are giving you the best nourishment possible. So the types of things I look for in prenatal vitamins are they using methylfolate, a folate version of B9 versus folic acid? Are they adding adequate amounts of vitamin D and choline and a variety of other B vitamins? WeNatal does it all. And I really, really love supporting them, and they have been supporting me. And without these two brands, we can't keep the lights on here. So go show them some love. Go find them on Instagram. Go do your research. But I am putting my stamp of approval on both of these companies, Immune Intel AHCC and WeNatal. Thank you guys for making this show possible. All right, without further ado, here's my conversation with Kia Lanneman. And one last thing I wanted to say is if you here's something that's inspiring here, share it with your friends. If you like something about this episode or any episode, leave a 5-star review. It really, really matters to the algorithm that kind of oversees who gets to hear these conversations. So we're working very hard. We're getting a lot of traction in the community. But if you have friends or family that would benefit from this, please share with them. A lot of the topics that we discuss here are unpacked even further in the Born Free Method, which is a program that I co-created with Sarah Rosser. You can go to bornfreemethod.com to learn more about that. It is the most comprehensive and complete preconception through postpartum program that you'll find on the planet. And that's done intentionally because you require a continuum of care no matter how many babies you have, and you get lifetime access no matter how many times we update it. You never invest more money. You also get direct access to me. You get weekly calls with the community. You have a private community to share insights. I will share journal articles there. It's really the best way to get into my sort of sphere of influence. So bornfreemethod.com. And if you're a birth worker looking to learn skills around breech or twins, or really looking to heal yourself, everything is going to be included in the experience that I'm offering in August here in Louisville, the 2024 Born Free Twins Breech Conference. You can go to bornfreetwinsbreech.com. That's BREECH.com. And the spots are filling up quite quickly. But you can go there and secure a spot. There's also a live stream option. If you need a payment plan, you let me know. If you're a student, you let me know. I will make it work for you because I don't want anybody to have to miss out on this incredible opportunity to learn from people like Stu Fishbein, Rick Safries, Tracy Vogel, Hermine Hayes Klein, Betty Ann Davis. The Spinning Babies team is coming out. We're going to have David Hayes and all of these simulators for you to get lots of hands-on practice so that if that surprise breech rolls in through your triage or in your home birth experience, you're going to have the skills, and then you're going to also be inspired to put those skills to use. You're going to meet so many incredible people at this event. Go to bornfreetwinsbreech.com if you're interested. All right. I've said this now 3 times, but without further ado, here is my lovely conversation, which is one of the longer interviews I've ever recorded with Dr. Kia Lanneman, MD, OBGYN, MFM, an extraordinary human, and I'm so grateful to have her on the show. Dr. K, when you and I started chatting about home birth way back in the day, and I had invited you on, and at the time I was in sort of a shitstorm on social media about my insistence on eating healthier food and maybe doing a better job of counseling around things like birth control. And the reality is when you're in the social media space, you don't get to know a person really fully in 90 seconds, these little snippets of our life that people get to see. But you had posted something about home birth, and I was like, oh, a doctor talking about home birth. And lo and behold, you're not just an OBGYN. You went for some extra, you're like extra sort of masochistic. You went for extra training, as did I, but more than me. You went to become a maternal fetal medicine doctor. Some of my best friends are MFMs. Many of them are not practicing anymore, but you are actually in the trenches. You're doing it. You got your diplomas on the wall behind you. If you guys aren't watching on YouTube, Dr. K is like in her clinic. She is doing her thing. Or are you at home now? I'm curious.
This is my home office.
This is your home office. Gotcha. So I guess for those who don't know, why don't you just tell us, what does the journey to becoming a high-risk OBGYN and MFM, what does that look like?
Sure. So there are fellowship programs. Maternal fetal medicine is one of the subspecialties within the umbrella of obstetrics and gynecology. It's in the obstetric category. And the fellowship is generally 3 additional years after you finish your OBGYN training. Research is generally part of a standard fellowship. You're expected to pursue some area of research and either publish it or at least write a thesis that you get evaluated on, and as part of your saying that you've completed the training. And in current times, it also includes a significant amount of ultrasound training in terms of doing what we call prenatal diagnosis, where we evaluate the unborn child for looking for development features and looking for things that look a little bit different than normal, what we call maybe anomalies, procedures related to that, even some interventional things, whether it comes to like transfusions or stents, some may come through that pathway. And then exposure to complications of pregnancies to become familiar, or at least have had some level of being involved in the care of the zebra things, the things that unusually
Yeah.
and uncommonly happen, but that when they do happen, everybody else freaks out and turns to the maternal fetal medicine person and say, what, what should we do with this? So that's kind of where the current training is. In the past, I would say at least 1 or 2 generations back, and some of those MFMs are still practicing, ultrasound would not have been as much a part of their work. And so they may be more heavily involved in either the research and the maternal complications and not as much on the fetal diagnosis.
Yeah. 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 I mean, you guys, when I was in my residency training, I also did fellowship, but I went to hospice and palliative care, which is obviously tremendously different training from 3 hard years of research and ultrasound, and everything else. It was a lot more being quiet and listening, which is actually really, really relevant to the practice of an MFM, but because you spend so much time with certain clients for various reasons. So much so that I would even say you're dealing with patients. You're oftentimes dealing with people who actually have some, maybe a higher risk of pathology, or they actually have a clinical diagnosis that puts them like truly in the high risk category versus advanced maternal age and nulliparity, these kind of soft risk factors. You're dealing with like the really hard stuff that people really don't want to hear, that, they don't want to hear those diagnoses coming through. So I'm curious, whenever when I was in residency, the MFMs were called on so frequently because the generalists just had their hands in so many different buckets that it was like, oh my gosh, I don't even have the energy to think through this. And we would just refer out to you guys. And of course, you would gladly take them in and do the level 2 ultrasound and look at the outflow tracts of the heart. I'm curious though, I never really imagined what that type of training would look like. Was it as hard as residency to do this fellowship? Like, were you still kind of like trying to prove yourself every moment of every day, or did they accept you more as like, okay, you've proven your chops, now let's help you fine tune your instruments?
Well, I think fellowship can look different at different places.
Yeah.
I went to an uncommon place for fellowship, so I would say my fellowship was rather intense and hard. But I was really glad that I went there and that I trained and worked with people that I worked with, and just I learned a lot about how to think, and did a lot of certain things that really kind of helped me in my career later on, that I'd gotten so much volume and experience with some things that not everybody gets the experience to do. So I think, it depends. I think you can go to places that are where it may not be as hard as residency, and you may feel like you're kind of on a pedestal and protected and given a lot of support. But I would say my fellowship program is pretty rigorous.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean,
it had a reputation. It had a reputation for being untraditional. I mean, even people didn't even want to interview there. Like, for the just to give you an example, we had to give like a 20-minute presentation during an interview on a topic, and that alone, like, I'm not going to anywhere that I have to present in front of a crowd for 20 minutes on anything. But it was, I mean, I feel very privileged and honored to have trained where I trained, and it made me a good clinician. It made me a thinker. My mentors taught me to think, and they taught. So I feel like I just need to just give flowers where flowers are due. So one of my mentors was Dr. Roberto Romero, and he is going to go down as one of the most impactful OBGYNs in American history. He will go down in the Hall of Fame, if we do Hall of Fames in obstetrics. But one of the best lessons I learned from him was to think for myself and to read the data for myself, and not just to go with the flow of the greater organization takeaway points from things, but to find the information and see if you would come up with those same conclusions, and to really do your due diligence of reading who has contributed to this topic,
Yeah.
and learning how to critically look at it, um, and not just be a follower. And so I think that some people are noticing that I'm a little bit different than my peers, but I was taught differently than some of my peers. I was
Yeah.
taught not to just take whatever my society or organizations say and not do my own thinking on the matter. And
Yeah.
sometimes when I do my own thinking on the matter, I disagree.
Yeah.
But I was encouraged to, I was supported in making those kind of disagreements and saying,
Yeah.
oh, I see this differently. So
Well, what I think people probably like to think about doctors, and you don't have to, by the way, for anybody listening, I am really desperate to find another doctor who, like, we could go out and have beers all night and just disagree on everything and still love each other the next day. Like, that is how we
I
learn.
love debate. Oh, it's like one of my languages.
You and me.
It's not like something that should cause us to lose relationship. It's just
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a form of discussion. It's like to have differing points of view. I love debate. Some people get off put by it, but I just think that that if you feel really strongly about something, you should be able to speak on the topic. And then as people have differing views, if they can be civil and engage the process of debate, they may find areas of commonality. They may find areas um, ideas that they hadn't thought about before that other person helps bring to their attention. So I find it very fun and engaging.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
might be that person. I mean, but I don't know. Maybe we have similarities. So maybe we would have a lot. I don't know. I
Well,
don't
I
know.
mean, your eyes perked open when I said going out and have beers. So that would
I
be a lot of fun.
I can't stand beer. I'm not a beer girl, but but debate. Oh my gosh,
Yeah. Yeah.
get
Yeah.
a fun argument. I love it.
One thing that I think is the first thing that comes to mind is I know the Dalai Lama. Everybody knows the Dalai Lama. He is he's a staunch vegetarian, and they said, so you never eat meat. And in one interview conversation, I heard him say, well, listen, a lot of people like to cook for me, and as a Buddhist, it's more important to be kind than to be right. So if I'm served meat, I eat meat, but I am on this path to being a vegetarian to the best of my abilities. And I feel like that is how we could all show up. Where is it more important for you to be right, or is it more important for you to have close people in your life? And I am abundantly wealthy through the lens of having good people to be able to talk to and run my ideas past. And I love being shown that I'm wrong about something. Like, my wife will tell you this. Like, I thrive on it, because that's the only way we can learn, is if we get out of that space where we think we're right and we let our ego kind of allow us to tiptoe over here. And then Dr. K comes in and is like, well, actually, you might want to look at it this way. And then suddenly I'm like, oh no, I was wrong. But how many times as doctors are we incentivized to admit I was wrong? I made a mistake. It just doesn't really happen. In fact, there might be punitive measures. So before we even get into the range of topics that came in when I asked my community, um, what are we to do in a world where doctors are not even, I mean, we don't even do formal M&M conferences at most hospitals anymore, because people are aghast at this notion that they have to stand in front of a crowd of their peers and admit, you know what, I think I made a mistake and I'd like you guys to help me clean up my practice. That's what M&M used to be. For those who don't know, it's when you stand in front of a room of surgeons and they pepper you with questions about a case that went wrong, perhaps, and you have to sit there and take it and then defend what you did. And hopefully you guys come to a resolution. But I'm sure that at times felt pretty, it was probably not done in the most compassionate way. And now, without having that feedback, none of us can really learn anything more than what we learned in school. And we continue to do the same things because there's not a space to share those new ideas. So what do you think about that?
I think, I don't know if some of that information is discoverable also for litigation, and whether that is part of the move away from some of those talks. I also think it was done a lot for the learner,
Yeah.
um, and I feel like there, in my experience, where the places that I've worked with learners, people are moving away from Socratic teaching to a really um, student centered, where like what is centered is student comfort or learner comfort. And I don't know that, I don't think that's the best place to go, because I don't think
Mm,
that learning is comfortable. And I don't think that
yeah,
change is comfortable. And I don't think that growth is comfortable. And if we center the comfort of the learner, and it's always bad if they feel uncomfortable, then I think that we are going to undermine their learning process. And I do question, as I think all previous generations of providers have questioned, what is being passed on to the
yeah,
next generation, and whether the quality of what the next generation is learning is sufficient. And
yeah,
I think even more so now, I know you've had some posts about, residents should be demanding to learn breech. And, I feel like residents should be working with midwives as much as possible to just be exposed. I do think that, um, I'm concerned about
yeah,
about what people the extent of what trainees are learning in current times, and how much they're not being exposed to, how many
yeah.
skills are not being passed on, the work ethic. There's a lot, and so I question whether some of that move away from morbidity mortality conferences is, because maybe young trainees complained that they felt uncomfortable in that process, or whether there were concerns that that information was going to be used for litigation, that it could be, requested and it wouldn't necessarily be protected, and whether it would put individuals at risk if they were sued for outcomes. I feel
I
like
haven't
those
even
are the
thought about
things.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I guess it's still, I guess that what we can say, I think we could both agree that we probably need a reformation in some way going forward for the educational process. And I don't know. I mean, I don't. We don't need to get into the weeds there. I just feel, and I'm not coming at this as like, back when I was a resident. I don't mean it even like that. I don't think 120-hour work weeks make any sense either. But it does seem like there's a lot of textbook learning. There's a lot demanded of residents, and they're still lacking certain skills, which I know I was. When I came out, I
Yeah.
had to actually go and practice certain things that I never really was exposed to. So anyways, I'm sure we could riff on that in a totally separate conversation, but there's a couple questions from the community that came through, and you are a high risk OB. If we don't get two of them all today, Dr. K, we'll do another one. And I want to encourage people to listen to this conversation, not because you need your internal bias supported or your personal experience supported. We're going to try to just be objective, because that is a part of what doctors do. And not every single thing we say is going to apply to every single person in every single circumstance, but we have to do our best with the data as a part of evidence-based medicine. So, Dr. K, let's
Yes.
start with
I love the disclaimer.
there was a very interesting case that came to me just 2 days ago that I wanted to run by you. This is a baby that was diagnosed with anhydramnios, and the kidneys, developed what I would perceive. I haven't seen the all of the reports, but it sounds like this baby is developing a pretty gnarly form of polycystic ovaries. And so the baby's not making urine, and therefore there's not a lot of amniotic fluid, if any. And of course, if I recall, that also is going to impact the development of the lungs. And we've got an overall problem here for when this baby arrives. So this couple, first pregnancy, very, very Christian. And even when they got this diagnosis at 18 weeks, they weren't going to terminate. So for those out there wondering, yes, that could have been an option, but they decided to continue. And now at 32 weeks, they go into preterm labor. So up until this point, they've been told that I am so sorry in the sweetest way possible. There's very, very little we're going to be able to do for this child. Now, whether or not that is true, because you don't have all the information, now she's in preterm labor and the baby is butt first. So they want to do a vertical C-section to, right, to deliver a baby that has already been determined is not going to have much quality of life, if any length of duration of life after the birth, whenever the baby arrives. So in your practice, I'm a perinatal palliative care specialist. Like, this to me was like gold. Like, let's get into this. Let's talk about what you're hoping for, what the possibilities, let's maybe some data, whatever. But from your standpoint as an MFM, where do you start with this conversation? This is a really, really hard, a really sticky situation for this couple.
It's very complicated, and I'm sure that there's a lot more to it, than what we could share. Um, and it's really helpful in situations like this to involve somebody from either perinatal hospice, palliative care, to bring in the neonatal intensive neonatologists into the discussion, to have a maternal fetal medicine provider and or the prenatal provider if they're not the same, and oftentimes they're not the same. But I think in this situation, there are so many factors to talk through. So one, the question is, how long has the fluid been low? We know with polycystic kidneys, if the absence of fluid or the anhydramnios or significantly low fluid starts very early, like in the mid-second trimester, that's the most likely to have a devastating outcome.
Yeah.
Because that middle trimester is very, very tied to amniotic fluid levels and lung developing. And so if it started then usually the lungs are underdeveloped. Um, and so the baby may survive the pregnancy, but may not survive delivery, may not survive the first day of life,
Hmm.
just due to very, very stiff lungs that did not do all the branching of like a tree. Like the pulmonary tree is supposed to be this big tree with all these branches to get oxygen from the air. And if that doesn't happen well, then it's just stiff. And even the best of efforts to give supplemental oxygen can still even injure those lungs because they're just so stiff. They don't move easily. They're not flexible and pliable. The other part of it is that that child also very likely has renal failure. And not all places do dialysis for newborns. Um, even the children that do qualify for dialysis, they may be getting dialysis for like a year before they can even potentially get a kidney transplant. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a lot of morbidity and infection, and just that is very challenging even for those that even qualify for dialysis, and dialysis is not even done in most places. Then there is a wait to qualify for dialysis, and most preterm babies are going to be too small for that wait. So you have a preterm kid, unborn, already facing multiple challenges that are at odds with surviving the first
Mm.
birth, and the baby is breech. Now, the one, there are multiple ways to, if you're in preterm labor, one, you can support vaginal breech delivery of that preterm baby, acknowledging that the mode of delivery may not play a significant impact in how that child does after delivery. That
Right.
that that the mode of delivery is that vaginal delivery of breech babies generally can be done safely, and there might be some mild increased risk or mild difference in the outcomes between those children when they're born at term or even preterm, as long as they're past like 26 weeks or so, but they don't have anomalies. But this child has an anomaly that's very
Yeah.
significant. So breech delivery is unlikely to be the difference between life and death for
Right.
this child after delivery. That child is already at a disadvantage where death is the most likely outcome after delivery, no matter how they deliver. Then you want to talk about, okay, well, C-section is an option. Maybe it can mildly improve the outcomes immediately at delivery. But a 32-week baby can probably even have be delivered by a low transverse. It's
Yeah.
unlikely that you need vertical incision or a classical incision that's even more dramatic. Classical goes all the way to the top of the uterus versus like a low vertical just stays in the lower part of the uterus and goes vertical on the womb. But I would argue that a normally grown, which I don't know if this baby is small or not, but even if there's no fluid, a normally grown 32-week baby, if the mom elected C-section, could very likely have a side-to-side low transverse incision on the womb, because some providers are even doing that at 24 weeks and 25 weeks,
Yeah.
which is like impressive to,
Yeah.
I've had some moms say, oh no, my provider did low transverse at 25 weeks. And I'm like, really? Because so small at that point in time that oftentimes you don't have enough side-to-side room to make that type of incision, because the womb is small because the pregnancy is premature. But at
Yeah.
30, that's generally not going to be the case. And so, and then, another option is, so there's several options. And I think the
Yeah.
family and the mom needs to know, what are the risks of different C-section incisions to her in the short term and in her future pregnancies, and really be allowed to say whether or not she wants to bring that risk into play. But I think they really need to be transparent about how concerning the situation is for this child, and that um, the odds are stacked against that child, and make sure that they make a decision in light of that,
Yeah.
and that some of these decisions are very unlikely to significantly impact how that child does.
Sure.
But I
Yeah.
mean, I would think there's so many things that could be done. I mean, if a mom wanted to deliver at home breech, I don't think that should be off the table, right?
Yeah.
Comfort measures, hold their baby, because is the outcome going to be that different?
Right.
You know,
Right. Right.
um, or just the vaginal breech delivery. If she's
Hmm.
already in labor, her body might already be doing that. I don't know if there are providers that feel comfortable and feel skilled at that facility. Um, should she be transferred to a place where those options are available?
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so a lot of
Well,
questions.
the reason I even brought this case up is just to help people appreciate the complexity of some of these decisions, where it's not just baby's breech, go to C-section or whatever. Like, there actually needs to be a really, really probably in-depth multiple family meetings, if possible, as to what these possible scenarios will mean, starting from the point of what are you hoping for?
Yeah,
Some families might say, even if our baby lives for a month longer on dialysis or something, even if it means that they're never going to have that, no matter what we do, they're not going to have, be walking across the stage, graduating high school or something someday, they might want that extra month, or they might see that extra month as putting their baby through a prolonged dying process, in which case maybe comfort focus at the time of birth, which is, by the way, guys, not giving up. It is not anti-Christian. It is not it doesn't mean you're a bad parent. It just means that actually maybe you're making a decision from a space of love. And instead of just rushing to this sort of binary decision making that we all do, and that helps us in many regards, in many situations. But in this case, this is super highly complex. And I think it really starts with just eliciting, what is this person's value? Like, what are their values and what is their goal? Like, they're the parents, obviously. So thank you. I mean, we could go for an hour on that one alone, because there is so much. There are so many possible variables that could influence that decision-making tree. But so I want to get into, you mentioned home birth. So there was a home birth tri triplets recently down closer to me. And first one was cephalic, first one was breech, and the third was extracted breech.
okay.
And
The
this
second one was
one,
breech.
second one was breech, and the third came down. I think that the third kind of was restituting in like an oblique position. So somebody, the midwife went in and extracted, but this is a midwife.
The mom just delivered on her own, like a spontaneous breech.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. And so, I'm curious, a lot of people ask about multiple gestations, and automatically it puts you in this high risk category for a variety of reasons. And of course, there's plenty of different scenarios where that may be true or not. But isn't that the wildest thing as an OBGYN to hear about vaginal triplets? Like, that is
I know
really
an
awesome.
MFM that did vaginal triplets. I thought it was wild when he did it, but I was at a particular place, And this provider was very skilled. They did forceps. To me, when somebody does forceps, that tells
Oh
me
yeah.
they have skills that, people don't have anymore. And he made the comment, well, once you deliver the first one, they're twins. And I was like,
Oh, that's amazing.
and so I think the first one, I think the mom went into preterm labor, and I think the first one was on her own, kind of couldn't be prevented. And then it was like, okay, well, now we're dealing with twins. And so,
That's
I mean,
amazing.
let's just continue this process. But yeah, I was like, an MFM delivering triplets vaginally? I was like, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
Yeah. Yeah.
honestly, I think it is unorthodox. But the question is, why is it?
Yeah.
Because moms should be counseled and supported to take the risks that they believe are acceptable. And there is a mild increased risk when you add additional babies in the womb that the second and subsequent babies may have some decreased early assessments in terms of, if we do like a scoring of how they transition from in the womb, outside of the womb, they may have some decreased score values, and their oxygen levels, if we check a cord gas, their oxygen levels may be a little bit decreased. But overall, it's not a dramatic difference between the first child and the second or subsequent. But that difference has been used for people to not even support vaginal delivery at all for twins. I mean, I've met some moms who, if they had a twin pregnancy, their provider was like, I think you should just have a C-section because it's better for the second twin. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
different. There are
Yeah.
different risks associated with C-section compared to vaginal birth. And so
Yeah.
I think that's amazing. I think these kind of stories inspire me. I don't think they're for everybody. Definitely moms that have multiple babies have different risks in their pregnancy, different things that can happen. But to me, those kind of stories I think are pretty cool. Like,
Yeah. I mean, it's like when we were in med school and somebody would like show you some crazy anomalous thing that was just, found on autopsy or something in 1884, and you see it and you're like, whoa, that's wild. Or, I mean, it could just be, the ED docs who get an x-ray of the abdomen and they find something very unusual in the rectum. Like those types of things are always just like, wow, I didn't think that was possible to get that up there, but, when I hear these stories, it really helps me appreciate that. Well, first off, the woman who carried and then birthed these triplets, she was very, very much not anti anything. She just knew who she was, and she knew that she felt so much better doing this at home. And that was a part of it. Like, she wasn't scared. She wasn't really leaning into this what if conversation. She was like, I don't want a C-section. And I've been taking care of myself, and I'm going
and
to do
had
this.
a C-section, right? Like, that's the
Yeah.
reality. The reality is that once you say triplets and above, in the medical mind, it's the orthodox thing to say, or the conventional thing to say, is that's a C-section delivery.
Right. Right.
Like automatic. There's almost no question about it.
Yeah.
So good for her, to
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
no, I don't want that. I think I can do this. And I saw this video on Instagram, and it spoke to me. It
Mm.
was mom. I think she was like laboring in the tub, and she was speaking over she had a voiceover, and essentially the takeaway point was, I chose home birth because I believed in myself. I chose to say, I think I can do this, not to just focus on the what if this can happen, what if that can happen, what if this can happen, what if that. Like, she said, I chose to just believe that it would go well. And it just spoke to me so much, because we often in obstetrics, we focus so much on what could go wrong. And there's a role for being prepared by being aware of things that could go wrong and preparing, so that if you encounter that problem, you are not caught off guard, and that you've brought your tools with you. You know what steps you would take. But there's also a role for saying, the great majority of the time, this is going to go right. And putting my energy and my thoughts and meditating on that and believing myself. And I just thought, man, that's so powerful to say, like, instead of focusing on what could go wrong in a home birth, I chose to just believe what could go right. To just
Yeah.
focus on like what that I could do this and that it would be fine. And it was fine. And home birth isn't for everybody. There are going to be some people in certain scenarios that's not going to be accessible to them. It's not going to be a
Yeah.
good idea for them. It's not going to be within their values or what they want. But it's for me as a physician, I just love that video. It was like so inspiring me. And I love these stories from the moms who are taking back their power and their autonomy, and they're believing in themselves. They're having a vision for their childbirth experience. And they're just like, but like, what if this doesn't happen? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
what if this becomes a beautiful, moment in my life history, in my life's her story. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I really, Michel Odent, everybody knows him now. He had told me one day, like one time when we spoke, he said, what if all of this literature that's coming out every year, the green journal, the gray journal, which by the way, guys, the green journal is like the generalist OB journal. And then there's also this gray journal, which is the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. I think that's generally the one that's sort of in cooperation with the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine. But these are the two journals that really feed us in North America, and it has a ripple effect around the world. There's volumes and volumes of data, but what if instead of just focusing on that rare, terrible thing and trying to avoid that, what if we equally attuned ourselves to when things go beautifully well? And what could we learn from those types of births and hearing those stories? I think it's almost like healing for the soul. That's how I feel when I was hearing you, share that story from Instagram. So, well, since we have this risk stratification system, which drives people a little bit bananas, we also have the one cure-all that when I was in residency, every single person seemed to be getting aspirin. Aspirin. And I'm curious from the way that you practice. Of course, we have to bear in mind that you do have partners and you're in a group and everything, but the literature is a little bit inconclusive as to when aspirin is the most beneficial and when it should be started and whatnot. So maybe as a rapid fire, you don't have to elaborate everything that's ever been published, but there was a recent, I think it was last month in the Green Journal. It was a question mark around this aspirin thing. Like, are we doing too much of this? Who really needs this? And of course, if you heard triplets, you would automatically say aspirin, but without without thinking just the triplets, who are like in your sort of gut feeling, knowing the literature and what you've seen in practice, where is aspirin the most useful in pregnancy?
Sure. So one, I have a lot of videos about aspirin.
Yeah, I know you do.
It's almost like if you're having a consult with me, you're almost going to get recommended aspirin unless I can roll it back. Like the threshold to recommend aspirin for me is very low. It's a low risk thing to offer. And has the potential to be preventative. And there are not that many things that we do in obstetrics that are preventative for later risks. So I'm almost always trying to figure out whether or not someone would benefit from aspirin. And then there are moms, I'm like, okay, you don't really have any risk factors. I'm not going to recommend it to you. But generally, so aspirin is meant to try and reduce the risk of preeclampsia. Preeclampsia, much of the time, is related to how the placenta develops. And so aspirin timeliness is really the best introduced before these big growth spurts in the placenta that happen around 16 weeks and 20 weeks. So the best timing of aspirin that has been studied is generally before 16 weeks. Some people like to start at 12 to get that first wave. There's been study even up through 28 weeks is cool, which is interesting because it's past those big growth spurts in placental development. And aspirin is really meant to be working on kind of in the placental organ.
Yeah, that's like during placentology, right?
Yeah,
Where as it's starting to form. Yeah.
yeah. But not everybody benefits from aspirin. So I think that's another concept. It's like population medicine because the number of people that need to take aspirin to prevent one case of preeclampsia is, I feel like it's at least 40. So it's not a one-to-one. Not every mom that has risk factors for preeclampsia and even takes aspirin is going to avoid preeclampsia. Then the dose has come into question. I currently, if I think somebody's got elevated risk factors for preeclampsia, I recommend 2 baby tablets of aspirin based on information that I've seen about a dose of 150 milligrams, which we don't have in our country. They have a dose like that in the United Kingdom and probably some other countries. But we don't have that dose. So taking 2 baby tablets gives a mom 162 milligrams a day. And that's as close as we're going to get in the US for the most part. So I
Yeah.
recommend that. And there's been some question about that dose. And I think the evidence is pointing towards that's probably the better dose. And then there's the question about the moms who currently have chronic hypertension, whether aspirin even works on them at all. Like, we know that they're at risk of preeclampsia. And it's unclear whether or not aspirin actually decreases their risk or if it just helps with the other moms who are at elevated risk. But I still generally, anybody that's moderately or at high risk of preeclampsia, I still do recommend aspirin for them. But those questions are out there.
Yeah, totally, totally. It's one of those things that the pendulum just swings both directions, and then you as the clinician need to just find your own sort of way of doing it and way of counseling so that a person appreciates the benefits and risks. I've seen a number of people probably have their pregnancy from the standpoint of preeclampsia saved just by virtue of aspirin. But I also have a lot of my clients, eating organ meats and dialing in their nutrition and their stress management and trying to prioritize sleep in some way. But honestly, like, a lot of the risk factors that are related to this preeclampsia are things that are largely out of a person's control, at least for the 9 months of growing a baby. So I'm thinking about this sort of chronic stress state that's perhaps led to, some really high blood pressures and some end organ damage in their first pregnancy. Nothing has changed. They're still living this really highly stressful life. And we just have to do what we can do. But there may be, I agree, I think there's a benefit for a lot of people to take a baby aspirin. The doubling up the dose is kind of new to me, but I just read that study that was kind of I think it was a systematic review from the Green Journal. And it did say, like, we probably would get more, we would have a lower NNT if we were using a higher dose. And because there's so little risk with aspirin, it might be more cost effective and actually beneficial for outcomes if we were going with a higher dose for those that really were certainly, truly higher risk. So,
That's definitely me at my current practice. And I do want to speak on what you were talking about in terms of diet and movement and managing sleep and stress. We don't talk about health optimization in
let's
Western
do
medicine.
it.
And there has been evaluation of those factors, and they have also been found to decrease the rates of preeclampsia and certain complications. So I think one of the things that we don't always kind of give attention to is that a lot of things that go awry in health are inflammatory conditions. There are things that, coronary disease is based on inflammation. Preeclampsia is an inflammatory disorder. Gestational diabetes is an inflammatory disorder. Eczema is inflammatory.
Lupus, all of these autoimmune conditions.
These are all inflammatory conditions, and there are multiple pathways to get to a place where your state of inflammation is out of control, and then you boom have this particular disorder. And so high cortisol levels contribute to inflammation. Being overexposed to toxic ingredients and elements in our foods, our water, our hygiene products, toxic relationships. Relationships can truly be toxic, right? and then not having enough in our lifestyle that counters that with antioxidants, that counters that with positive community, positive touch, that brings our stress down. And so some people have asked me, well, what if I don't like to take medication? I don't like to take tablets. What can I do to decrease my risk of preeclampsia? Things that decrease your inflammation levels, supplements or spices like turmeric, ginger, yoga and meditation that kind of de-stress you, regular movement in your body, going through your medicine cabinet or your pantry and removing all of these things that have concerning additives, things that are on the list of concerning ingredients. I like to use the environmental working group database to go through my kind of hygiene, regular tools, regular products, and say, okay, which of these things have cancer increasing, allergy forming,
Totally.
negative immune stimulating things. And there's a lot of junk out there, in some of the regions that have the worst maternal and newborn outcomes. The air quality is horrible. The water is contaminated. The living conditions are, they're downstream from a major plant for industrial making something, and that is one of the reasons that they are having all of these things, is because their environment has been polluted in a dramatic way, and it's having an impact on reproductive outcomes. So I think as people inform themselves about these things, and they can take control of some things. They can at least try to reduce some things with that knowledge. And it can be challenging for the mom that's not privileged, that might have finances that limit her. But there's still some things that we can take back control over in terms of reducing the excess exposure we have to things that create inflammation in our body. One of the things that's very also hard to control is prejudice, discrimination, and racism. So Black moms, that there have been studies about the meta-inflammation from just ongoing microaggressions, discrimination, all of the things that come with living in a society that had slavery at some point, and where people were treated as human. And even though we don't have that going on now, it doesn't mean that there's equity or that people don't continue to have a post-slavery system of experience of feeling unequal. And what does that do to that individual over time? This has been looking at, and it creates a situation of like this brewing inflammation in their life to have to address these things. And so positive community, like having places where you can de-stress, you can talk through those things, not accepting certain forms of mistreatment, not normalizing it or holding it in, yoga, stretching, prayer, meditation, like things that like bring you joy, like creating opportunities for joy to counter that stuff. I was listening to this talk. I know I'm rambling at this point, but I was listening to a talk by Mindy Peltz, I believe her name is, and it was called "Fast Like a Girl" or "Intermittent Fasting like a Girl." She talked a lot about the different hormones and how they change in the menstrual cycle. But one of the major points that I came away with is that oxytocin, the love hormone, is the paramount in the hierarchy. Cortisol is super effective, and cortisol is that stress hormone, and that is a pathway to multiple areas of dysfunction in health. High cortisol levels can lead to all kinds of health disorders over time. High cortisol level can lead to preterm birth, preeclampsia, like a significant number of bad pregnancy outcomes. But oxytocin is like the pinnacle of the hormones. And so if we can encourage those things that boost oxytocin, and we can counteract some of the cortisol pathways that are there from like the world and the environment in our daily life.
Yeah. Holy shit. Well, as you know, and hopefully most people listening, this is basically the entire platform. Like everything that I create is really guided towards what is one small thing you can do in order to lower your odds of something bad happening. And I like to remind people that whether it's a doctor or somebody else, they're giving you numbers that are based on averages. We have to use averages in order to just ascertain general risks. But if there's something you can do that can drop you down below the average, hopefully a whole standard deviation or two, then those numbers actually don't apply to you as much as they would the general population. But you as an individual have so much power in making it could be choose that $6 shampoo versus that $7 shampoo. And it might be a world of difference for how your endocrine system works, in 10 years. So when I mean, thank God you're saying all of this. And of course, there is racism woven through the very fabric of our society. So there's no real way to get around that as hey, just suck it up, buttercup. Like, that's not going to work. However, what you're saying is, which is actually what I believe, is I'm not perfect. And if I have the opportunity to do one small thing that's going to make life a little bit better for me and my family, then it's probably worth exploring that. And if we can make it work financially, it's going to mean a world of difference in the long term, in a world that really incentivizes to only think about problems in the short term. And so if you're listening to this and it's overwhelming to think about movement and stress and racism and diet and toxins and all this other stuff, just pick one little tiny thing. Cook one more meal per week at the house, which is still going to be better. Even if it's not the top organic, biodynamic beef, whatever, it's probably better than stopping at, Applebee's on the way back, because at least you know what's in there. And there's probably a little less seed oils and all this other stuff. So thank you, guys. And MFM agrees that we do have some role in mitigating risk here. It's not just, well, as fate will have it, you're doomed to have something, terrible happen to you in pregnancy. There's something there that you can probably do right now.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Changing our lifestyle, it's hard. It's hard.
Very hard.
And
Very hard.
there's a lot of investment to learn those things. It's not common knowledge. You have to go out of your way to inform yourself on those topics. But I think it can be really empowering. And I think there are a lot of people that are suffering in ignorance. They don't know that these things are working against them.
Yeah.
And and there are I think there's a lot of assumptions that we wouldn't be exposed to that. Like,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be so easy to be exposed to all these concerning things. Like, that we would have some protection based on our tax dollars.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I mean, you'd think so. These regulatory bodies. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, another topic. I don't know how long we're going to be able to go here for. Are you still good on time for the moment?
I'm good.
Okay, because I'm having a lot of fun with you.
If we're going too far down the road.
Yeah, no, I mean, it'll be like, I could talk to you for days. Like, we're on beer number 4 already, and you've got, like, I don't know, a bourbon or a cocktail or something. I don't know, but
Or
it's okay. Yeah, there we go.
Or a Cosmo, one of the two.
A Cosmo, yeah. My wife used to be a bartender, and she made some of the best, like, fruity drinks that I never would have ever tried before, except she'd have leftover and I'd be sitting there drinking a beer. And I was like, I could probably get into this. I think this is called getting older, where you just, like, want to enjoy your drink and not be, like, pinching your nose and sucking it down to, like, escape your inner feelings. So, well, since we're on the lifestyle diets sort of talk, I know that we're gonna butt heads a little bit on this one, which is why I want to do it.
Okay,
So, do you think that every person should take a prenatal? Just a yes or no? Or let me reframe that. Is it necessary to take a prenatal to have a healthy birth and birth and pregnancy?
What do you think my answer is going to be?
I think you're going to say most people would probably benefit, because it's really, really hard to meet your dietary needs through a very nutrient deplete sort of agricultural system. I bet your mind goes in that direction, but I'm curious.
Well, I have a video that, like, where I think somebody asked me, is a prenatal vitamin make or break in pregnancy? And I was like, no, it's not. So
okay, you and I agree again. Well, we'll go further with this, but yeah, go on.
So most of the one of the things we want from a prenatal is additional folic acid, and the value of that is during, like, conception and the forming of your embryo, when the body parts are forming. it can help you a little bit later on in preventing some forms of anemia if you're sensitive to folic acid deficiency. Um, but the critical window, a lot of people aren't even taking a prenatal vitamin at that point in time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like most pregnant, about 50% of pregnancies are unplanned, which means that people are not taking prenatal vitamins before they get pregnant or during the window of time that they don't know they're pregnant, which is when their baby's forming. And so by the time the typical mom starts a prenatal vitamin, like the impact on formation of the baby is already completed. And so then at that point, you're just like supplementing your diet, and I, I don't, I would say, I don't know whether or not things are really significantly different, for like, there are a lot of moms that don't take prenatal once they have nausea and vomiting because it, makes them vomit, or they stop at a particular time and you can't tell, you can't differentiate them from anybody else at the end of the pregnancy. There are moms that are taking prenatal with iron and they still are iron deficient in the third trimester, so, I don't know that I recommend it, but um, and we do use as strategies for moms that are having significant nausea, just take a folate or folic acid supplementation and get rid of the other components, or at least to remove the iron if there's an iron addition. But that's an acceptable alternative, is just to do the folic acid and not to do it prenatal. So then, that calls into question, like, how useful it really is. But I mean, I believe in a daily multivitamin. I take a multivitamin even
yeah,
now.
yeah,
So
yeah. Hey guys, it's Nathan. Wanted to interrupt this amazing conversation very briefly to talk to you, specifically if you're a birth worker. This goes for doulas, childbirth educators, midwives of all sorts, whether you're out of hospital or in hospital, and especially the OBGYNs, the family medicine docs, those of you who are attending to births. I want you to ask yourself, if a person rolls into your practice and they're in labor and there's a bud emerging from the vagina, what are you going to do? What I was taught to do was, let's rush you to the operating room. Forget about informed consent. We have to do this through the abdomen. We have to do a C-section because the baby is breech. But frankly, I think a lot of women, rightfully so, want to avoid C-section, unnecessarily, of course. And so if you were to just rely on let's say your OBGYN residency training, you're not going to have the skills to attend to a breech birth. The good news is most breech babies come out without any intervention at all. But in the rare chance that they have a nuchal arm or a hyperextended neck or whatever, you want to have those skills. And it requires practice on practice on practice to get those skills, which is why I started hosting an annual conference here in Louisville. And in 2024, we're going to be leveling up this entire program. This is the 2024 Born Free Twins-Breech Conference, where you're going to be able to get plenty of simulator experience with very, very well-trained educators and instructors. You're going to hear from a variety of midwives and some doctors. This year, we're featuring the Spinning Babies team, Breech Without Borders team. Stu Fishbine's going to be there. Christine Laria is coming with the Breech Without Borders team. She was a recent addition. Carol Gauchi from the Pacific Northwest is coming. We're also bringing two keynote speakers, Machilo Motse, who's a newly crowned PhD from South Africa, as well as Doña Angelina Martinez Miranda from Cuernavaca, Mexico, is coming. These are instructors that have quite a bit, a breadth of knowledge and experience in order to help round out your own education. I haven't even mentioned Tracy Vogel, who's an OB anesthesiologist. She's going to be coming in to talk about trauma-informed care. Hermine Hayes-Klein is coming to speak to informed consent. There is so much that we're offering here. And I've only gotten to the didactics part. There's going to be plenty of time to practice on very realistic mannequins. And there are going to be some other activities for you to do some healing and as a means of community building. So we're going to do some trauma release work, a musical odyssey with Rebecca Kelly G. There's going to be some ecstatic dance in the mornings if you're open to that. It can be very, very releasing because we suppressed so much of this stuff throughout our lives that if we can't use our voice and our bodies in an expressive way, it's going to become a second chakra issue. It's going to impact our reproductive organs and our overall health. We're going to be screening Aftershock and having a panel discussion with Shawnee Benton Gibson and Omari Maynard, both of whom were featured in the film because Omari's wife, who is also Shawnee's daughter, she died as the result of what I would call medical negligence due to the color of her skin in the medical system. And that's what Aftershock, the film, is all about. We're going to do a breath workshop with Sarah Tromoli of Effigy Breath. There is just so much healthy food, healthy community, healthy conversation in a very, very safe space. No breakout sessions. You're all going to be in the same room together in a very intimate setting, which I think is very, very important for this work. If you're interested in coming, go to bornfreetwinsbreech.com. Register as early as you can because the price will gradually increase as we get closer and closer to the event. There are a few opportunities available for work exchange for students or people who are otherwise unable to attend for financial reasons. But everything will be on site at the Omni Hotel in downtown Louisville, a beautiful hotel with some very, very beautiful meals and beautiful spaces that we're all going to be sharing together. I hope to see you in Louisville. The dates are August 8th through the 11th with an opportunity to do either NRP certification or a simulator intensive workshop with one of our instructors on the 12th if you want to stick around. And for those who stick around, maybe there'll be some other goodies along the way. bornfreetwinsbreech.com. I hope to see you in Louisville. All right, let's get into the weeds a little bit. So most prenatal vitamins that people can afford readily, like they can go to Sprouts or whatever, and they've got their gummy bears. Oh, they're so delicious. In fact, when my wife was initially pregnant, we just picked up gummy bears and we were just eating gummy bear candies all the time. And we were getting some nutritional value. Hooray. But then we noticed there's all these artificial dyes and all this other sugar and junk in it. And it was like, well, this doesn't make sense to be taking this during pregnancy. So we ultimately didn't do any prenatal vitamins. Now, there's a couple big companies that are coming out on the market. WeNatal happens to be my preferred vitamin right now. They do have a little bit of iron. They do have, which, by the way, the reason, if you're listening, you're taking iron and you're still iron deficient, you might want to get your ferritin checked. You might want to do some other iron indices because you may have an absorption issue, which is pretty common in the United States. Mm-hmm. But anyways, there's a whole bunch of other nutrients, and you've mentioned folic acid, and this is definitely one of the more controversial things in the wellness space.
Okay.
So I'm not going to lead you here in any more than I already have, but this MTHFR thing, people are getting this tested now over and over and over. I'm seeing it all over the place.
Where you're going. I thought you were going to ask me about the difference between folate and folic acid because I really, I'm not even... But that's okay. Well, let's go to the MTHFR. This is perfect.
I've got you. So MTHFR, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. If you have a mutation, you can get a wide spectrum of expression of an enzyme that's required for you to convert to utilize folic acid through this B12 and methionine and homocysteine, this whole biochemistry thing that we remembered and then we forgot about. But as I'm starting to discover that more and more people are being found to be positive, I'm realizing, oh man, they probably aren't able to utilize folic acid. However, we also have an industry that has made it almost impossible to make an affordable prenatal vitamin with folate. But if we could make that available, would you prefer folate over folic acid? And the caveat to this is that if it were cheaper, we would probably have more research into the bioavailability of methylfolate over folic acid. And unfortunately, a lot of European studies are finding, including one that was in JAMA, that when you're taking folic acid, if you are one of those people, up to 60% of the population has a variant of this MTHFR thing, the motherfucker gene, we used to call it, by the way, because it's impossible to say, that actually the folic acid, because it's not utilizable, can reach toxic levels and cause other impairments in child development and all these other things. So What say you about this debate around folate and folic acid? Because I know that you recommend folic acid because I downloaded your How to Choose a Prenatal Vitamin Guide. But if a person had enough money and they could go and buy WeNatal, do you see that as a problem versus a vitamin that has folic acid?
Okay, so my first question is, why are we even getting testing for MTHFR? And there are a host of maternal fetal medicine providers and OBGYNs who feel like people are being scammed into even being tested for this, and are being told that it explains too many things. If
Like
60% of
everything is your MTHFR. Yeah. Yeah.
60% of the population has some change in this, then is it just normal? Like, is this is just a this is just a variation of what we consider typical? And the laundry list of how many different disorders find some study to blame on MTHFR just seems implausible to be believable.
Yeah.
Uh, and so there are many OBGYNs, I would put myself in that camp, that I never recommend MTHFR testing. I almost never even talk about it. Even if I see it in somebody's problem list, I intentionally don't talk about it because I'm not going to tell you to do anything different with your life when you tell me you have an MTHFR heterozygous or homozygous change. I saw a great video by a medical geneticist who commented on this topic, and that essentially said there's that I don't want to misquote them, but it was a great video about how the great majority of the time people are not going to have any significant impact from MTHFR deficiency. And then I would also say that when I checked folate levels for people when they had anemia, um, they almost never have deficiency. So, I don't know if I'm just not checking the people that have MTHFR. The reality is, in order to even get, like, from my understanding, which is not something, I wouldn't say I'm a specialist on this particular topic. I haven't done a lot of research in it, but I have read into it. From my understanding, you not only do you need homozygous MTHFR mutation, but then that puts you at a risk of homocystinemia, but not everybody that's even homozygous will have that. So I don't know further about the breakdowns in how well you process folic acid. The reality is that when we even want levels to be optimized is in the first trimester. And that's often not when this discussion is coming up. When we even care about decreasing the risk of spina bifida related to maternal folate levels, it's in the first trimester during embryogenesis, in those first 9 weeks of pregnancy when that baby is forming.
Yeah.
After that, it really doesn't matter. Like, you could completely stop supplementation at that point in time, and maybe you'd have an impact on your blood count. But for the most part, that's the time that we want you to have high levels or an optimized folate. That's why, it's in certain foods. That's why we tell people to take prenatal vitamins before they're even attempting conception, to improve their levels in their blood prior to conception and during that early first trimester. Does that answer your question?
Well, I mean, yeah, sort of. Unfortunately, it's like when this is one of those things where I was like, oh no, am I wrong about this? And then I started reading and reading and reading. And I even found, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's not being really read, I guess, but it's not really, like, there's a million different journals. Like, not everything is going to be accessible to all of us, but there was one report that concluded that folic acid intake as little as 200 micrograms saturates the capacity of dihydrofolate reductase, which of course is a critical step in folic acid metabolism. And so you end up developing this pseudo-methylene tetrahydrofolate syndrome. And all that I guess I'm getting at is that we've got this cheaper synthetic form. Why not just utilize the more biologically active and bioavailable form of folate? And yes, we don't have a ton of robust studies to say that going at this dose of folate versus folic acid will, be as beneficial in preventing neural tube defects, for example. But wouldn't like nature be a better guide for this? Like forget the MTHFR stuff. If folic acid requires an extra step in order to be utilized, and by the way, in the blood, I don't care what's in the blood. I wonder how are the cells utilizing it,
Sure, sure.
which is hard to measure, except
Yeah.
homocysteine and all this other stuff. But at any rate, why isn't there more of a push for perhaps to study folate and to make it more widely available if it's in a more like it's a natural form? You find it in beef liver. Like, why not just give people a lump of beef liver every day, which in capsules or something like that, where it's actually going to have natural forms in, by the way, the biological proportions that we find it in nature. And, the MTHFR thing, I think, kind of muddies the water. I just wonder, like, why are we so married to this folic acid? Like, why not just start using folate? Like, I just don't really understand.
That's not, metabolism science and is not my area of strength. I think there's a lot to understanding metabolism and supplements. And as you know, there's not a lot of regulation that happens. There's not a lot of rigorous testing that happens. We, as consumers, we are kind of very vulnerable when it comes to vitamins and supplements in terms of understanding effectiveness and which forms are better. And there's all kinds of argument. Like, once you go down the supplement pathway, you can find all kinds of for this version versus that version. And it all comes down to the science of metabolism that a lot of people just don't understand. Like, nobody loves the Krebs cycle and metabolism. One of the hardest things to understand is how we use these different nutrients and resources, whether they need certain enzymes to go with them. Should we be getting them from their natural sources, which really we should be, like eating these natural foods that are rich in these things. But in our diets in the West, we are often like eating nutrient poor foods more often than we don't have these things. And then our soil is overused and abused, and it doesn't have the ability to kind of replenish itself. So even our natural foods are not as rich as they should be in minerals and nutrients. So, but anyway, my husband is very much into chemistry, and he used to be a bodybuilder and used to like be a personal trainer and understands the weeds of supplements and all of these like arguments about which supplement is best, what to take with what, what form. And I think this is going to be like an area of ongoing debate.
Absolutely.
For companies to be like, we've got the best one. And I don't think, and if there's no money in it, people aren't going to study it.
Yeah.
So that's the other part of it, is that like the pharmaceutical industry is not going to study vitamins.
Right. So it's a dead end.
The industry may not want to put out the money to study. Like there are some supplements that have good research behind them. But it's very expensive to do research. And so there's money behind research that's being done.
All of the money.
So if there's no money behind it, then we're not going to study it, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the reality.
Well, I do recommend all of my clients. I say, if like, let's say that they're a little bit older or they're a little bit worried about something, or they, for whatever reason, are unable to palate certain, very nutritious foods. Like I'll talk about beef liver in a second. I will say, okay, especially if they're like vegetarian or something, I'm like, okay, let's try to get you the adequate micronutrients and whatnot that you need. As I've mentioned, like WeNatal, who is, full disclosure, they are a sponsor of the show, but I've gone through them all. Like I've looked at them all really, really carefully. And this is an insurance policy for an already, reasonably healthy lifestyle. So beef liver, of course, is not something that many Americans like to eat, but we have a biodynamic farm down the street, and their liver is like $10 a pound. And a pound of liver is like way more than you probably need a pound of liver throughout your whole pregnancy. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how much people can eat, but
it's dense in iron and
it's loaded. I mean, like when you look at the breakdown, it's like it's got all of the vitamins, including 71.7 micrograms of folate in 1 ounce. It's got copper, it's got iron, magnesium. It's like everything you'd ever want in a supplement. And it's in this beautiful proportion to one another, meaning your body's going to know what to do with it and where to put it. So do you have any, have you been recommending any of these? Like the other ones I would add are bone broth, cod liver oil, eggs. You know, I even recommend smoked oysters, especially because a lot of my clients are struggling with fertility, and there's the zinc and copper and manganese and all this other stuff. But you know, what would you recommend to somebody if they were willing to go the distance? Like, is beef liver where you would point them, or I don't know, what would you say if they wanted to try to get it from food?
I definitely point them to the eggs for the choline. And I think there's a lot more that I need to grow in my understanding of nutrition medicine and botanical medicine. And I think it's a whole area of knowledge. And it wasn't something I was taught. And it's unfortunately something like Western physicians have to go out of their way to learn, because
It's not what we learn in school.
learn
Yeah.
about health. We don't learn about food. We learn about disorders.
Yeah.
And I would say that that's an area that I'm kind of having small incremental steps in learning, but it's not something I would say I'm an authority on.
Yeah.
But at least like the understanding choline. And I remember my daughter's essentially vegetarian, or like by default, she just won't touch any meat. Like it doesn't matter what it is, even if you call it another name, she almost will never even look at it, touch it. And so she was iron deficient, and I couldn't even find beef liver, but it was on the list of things to try and get to try and,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
pack in the iron for her. So
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, it just makes sense to me. Like this whole supplement game, I've had at least 100 companies reach out and want to work with me and collaborate and this and that. And I, at some point, actually right before New Year's, one of my resolutions was just, I got to stop with the supplements. Like I don't have the patience for it. I can read about the science and whatnot, but frankly, I'm like an outcome oriented person. I'm not like, this is what happens in the cell membrane in the mitochondria. Like, great, you have a mechanism that sounds plausible,
yeah.
but like, is it making people healthier to spend $60 extra for your special magic potion? I'm not so sure it really matters. Like my wife, the reason we didn't do prenatals is we were eating, you know, organ meats mixed into our meatloaf and whatnot. We were eating lots of eggs and doing fish oil from Nordic Naturals, like doing all these really, really good things. Like I don't make any money telling people to eat organ meats and whatnot, but I know that it's still probably the best way for you to get the nutrition. And if you need a prenatal, there's good companies out there. But to argue, like to start splitting hairs between this nutrient at this amount, like even the RDA system is kind of whack. It's like RDA, recommended daily allowance for who, of what size, of what activity level, of what age, you know, it's a little nutso to me, but,
Yeah,
okay.
it's hard to know. I mean, you've had to have good studies done with specifically with that supplement
Yeah.
in the short term of pregnancy to say, how did those outcomes change? And it's hard to get that
That's
kind
hard
of,
to study. Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. All right, Dr. K, let's see. What time is it? Oh my gosh, my dear, we could talk for days. Let me get one more here for you. Um, okay, sort of a rapid fire, if you could, because I do want to get into how you've seen changing abortion laws impacting the way that you can counsel around non-viable pregnancies. I want to get to that.
Sure.
So put a pin in that one. There's a lot of concern around the aging placenta and filamentous cord insertion. Everybody kind of packs this into this conversation around growth restriction.
Okay.
So can you help the audience understand when they should be really concerned around a baby being too small, and what you as an MFM would offer them from the standpoint of antepartum fetal surveillance in order to help, I don't know, give them some peace of mind?
Sure. This is a very controversial, highly debated question. So I think that's like the
Welcome
first
to
thing.
the podcast.
No, but I think no, it's not that like controversial that you're asking it. This is heavily debated amongst OBGYNs. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that that's like an important thing to just say up front for that pregnant mom, that family, there's not a standard on this. There's a lot of disagreement. There are multiple different ways to make recommendations for this scenario. And for some people that might be empowering for them to hear that maybe like there's another opinion that they could get on the matter if they talk to somebody else, if they don't like what was recommended from the first person that broached the topic with them. But so several different scenarios can cause a baby to measure smaller than expected. Genetics, infections, whether or not they have abnormalities or differences in the body parts that they've developed. And there's ethnicity. We know in general that in the Southeast Asian community, their babies trend smaller, and thankfully they use their own expectations in those countries. Like they have their own growth chart curves. They don't
mammograms. Yeah.
Right. They don't use our Western growth curves because it doesn't apply to them. And if they did, too many of their babies would be considered too small. So there's that. So, and then how do we define a small baby? There are different body parts that we look at. Some people will say, oh, if the estimated fetal weight is less than the 10th percentile, then that baby is small. Some people will say if the estimated fetal weight is less than the 5th percentile or less than the 3rd percentile. Some people will say, okay, well, if the abdomen is less than the 10th percentile, but even if the overall baby is in a normal size, predicted size, then I'm still considering that small. Or if the abdomen is less than the 5th, or the abdomen is less than the 3rd, right? So there's so many cutoffs. We're not even going to throw twins in the mix, which is coming under scrutiny of, are we using the right comparison for twins, because their growth tends to be different in the 3rd trimester, but we've been comparing them to singletons. Is that inappropriate? Are we over-diagnosing twins as small because we're comparing them to the wrong standards? Should we be comparing them to twin growth expectations, not singletons? And most ultrasound machines, if they have software built in, use a singleton growth expectation that they're comparing the measurements that we get to say, oh, does this baby plot small, large, or somewhere in the middle? So there's that. Then most of the time when I see a baby that I would consider smaller than expected, most of those cases are going to be mild. Those cases are very unlikely to have major complications to that baby prior to delivery. It is a smaller subset of the babies who truly do have growth restriction that will have significant complications come up. And those are the ones that get individualized recommendations for when to deliver based on the severity that when we do the ultrasound evaluation of them, and we see these patterns that are telling us that it's more moderate or severely advanced in its disorder, then we make recommendations. They're often going to be the ones that end up being preterm deliveries because of how complicated things get. Those are the ones everybody agrees on are growth restricted. Everybody else, there's a lot of disagreement about them. The ones that have severe growth restriction, everybody agrees. The ones that have mild growth restriction, some of those babies are probably within the realm of normal. They're probably not growth restricted at all. And many of them, their outcomes do just fine no matter what you do for them. Then there's also a range of when to recommend delivery for them, because now, again, we're just responding to like the growth pattern, but the growth is one part of the story. Sometimes there's more going on that will impact outcomes. It's not, the placenta often is involved in true growth restriction, but we make an assumption that it's involved all the time. We never really know until after the placenta comes out and we can study it. So there's some limits to, like, we make predictions based on some limited information. But in general, there's an overall assumption that if there is growth restriction going on, highly likely the placenta has some disorder in its function. There's, in general, expiration date on all placentas. In certain scenarios, the expiration date comes earlier than others because of maybe pre-existing conditions or disorders that are going on that will lead to deterioration of the placenta earlier than in some other situations. And so growth restriction is considered to be a scenario where there is very likely a certain percentage of deterioration of the placenta by the time the baby is growth restricted. And so most orthodox or conservative recommendations are going to be to avoid extreme weeks of pregnancy, the extreme ends of pregnancy. So generally, we advocate for not going past your due date for the most time. But then there's even variation about that. There are providers, there's a window that some of the things that people turn to in maternal fetal medicine or OBGYN about timing of delivery for certain conditions. There's a window of like 37 to 39 completed weeks for essentially mild growth restriction that's not so severe that you need to recommend preterm delivery. And so where a provider might fall in terms of their recommendation is going to also be based on, are they centrist or are they on this extremes or on the edges of recommendations? Do they always tend to recommend earlier delivery, or do they favor continuing pregnancy with ongoing supervision if things look fine and going for the ends of pregnancy? What value do they place on those last weeks of pregnancy? Do they see any value in it, or do they think it's not useful once the baby's term? And even there's like a divide. There are people like me who think, okay, my bias is, if I can safely prolong the pregnancy, I will advocate for later weeks of pregnancy before delivery, for ongoing brain development, for hopefully optimized potential for vaginal delivery,
Yeah.
avoiding C-section because of, difficulty to be able to induce someone. So that's my bias. I am always on the side of longer pregnancy as long as it can be safe. There are some people who, if there's an acceptable window on the early end, that's when they are calling it. Like if it's like, oh, we can recommend delivery at 37 to 39, 37 and 0. There are going to be providers that are on that end of the spectrum. I'm like 39 completed weeks, like 39 and 5 and 6, and just to initiate, you have to deliver, and even still, if you want to disregard my recommendation, stay pregnant after that and continue your supervision, that should be your choice. Like that's
yeah.
And then you have to go like in the middle. Okay, maybe I'll do 38 weeks. So there are many opinions on this, and the great majority of the families who are affected, their kids are going to do fine. And so I think if somebody's questioning the recommendation that they got, get a second opinion. Because you may very well get another person who has a significantly different perspective on. You may get somebody that says the same thing, but the majority of the time, these kids are going to do really well. And some of the time, they're not even small. It's just like poor imaging.
Yeah. Oh God. Well, here, let me tell you what happened to my wife. So my wife is super healthy, as I've already described, and we were pregnant with her first. We moved to Kentucky. She just established care with an OB. And because of the way OB practices, the generalist practices work, is you're going to see maybe a different doctor or CNM every time you're there. And so she was trending, her fundal height was trending beautifully. And then I think it was like at 37 weeks, she was measuring like 36 centimeters, right? And then at 38 weeks, she was measuring 34 centimeters. And they sounded the alarms and they were like, we got to get an ultrasound. And my wife was like, they want me to go get an ultrasound. And I was like, why? She said, well, she said the baby's like 3 or 4 weeks behind in growth. And I was like,
or maybe she dropped.
Yeah, right. And I was like, honey, because I don't want to be like, she's worried now and I don't want to be like, nonsense, forget about what they said. But I was like, honey, I think everything's okay. If you feel more comfortable having an ultrasound, I think it's fine. But what I suspect, honey, is that that our little girl is getting closer and closer to coming into the world. And I think that your fundus is a little bit shorter now. So I was trying to allay her fears without like being the doctor and just being the partner. But I was like, it's just because it switched hands and somebody only looked at this one point in time that it's 4 centimeters behind. But for those of you who are struggling to grasp what I'm saying, the baby descended into the pelvis and therefore the fundal height made it look like the baby shrunk. And of course that's ridiculous, but man, we get so fired up about this small baby thing. And like you said, sometimes babies are constitutionally small. since I did, I did want to just ask you real quickly, one of the unique tools that MFMs have, and by the way, we had a very busy MFM practice where I trained at Kaiser in Los Angeles. So we did a lot of Doppler velocimetry and as residents. And I'm curious if you could just clarify. A lot of people were like, they said that the umbilical artery is fine. Can you describe this practice of Doppler velocimetry of the umbilical artery? We don't need to get into the other, arteries and venous systems, but just this one in particular, why is this so relevant to the sort of discernment between a constitutionally small fetus and maybe some placental issue that's leading to a growth restriction inside the uterus?
Yeah. So the umbilical Doppler is an indirect assessment of the placental function. So the blood vessel of the umbilical arteries are going to the placenta. And so if there is some resistance to the forward flow of blood from the baby to come to the placenta and get oxygen, then the umbilical Doppler can help kind of demonstrate that. And so that's why most people will agree that if we have a smaller than expected baby and umbilical Doppler abnormalities, they agree that that is growth restriction. That's an area of agreement. When we have and that's usually also more significant. It's usually at least moderate to severe once you get to that stage.
Yeah.
And so the umbilical Doppler is essentially indirectly making some assessments of blood of the placenta and how well it's interacting to kind of get blood from the baby to oxygenate it so that to then send it back to the baby. And so if the umbilical artery Doppler assessments are not concerning, then most of the time, if there is even growth restriction going on, those babies are in the mild category. Okay. If there is some dysfunction going on, then that's probably true growth restriction caused by the placenta. And then it's either moderate or severe, depending on how significant affected it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a little abstract for people to understand what this whole thing is, which is why so many people come and ask me questions. And fortunately, I did get a lot of training on it, but I want people to appreciate that when your heart is beating, it contracts, blood is circulated out to the body. But even when the heart is relaxing during diastole, there still should be a forward movement of blood. And it's no different for a baby who's pumping blood, so to speak, to the placenta, that the heart is going to contract. And even when it's relaxing in that diastole, blood is still moving forward. But if there's some resistance on the other end of that pipeline that's actually pushing back and giving so much resistance, that might be some explanation as to why your baby's not being adequately nourished, so to speak, because their life support system is starting to fizzle out, so to speak. Did I do an okay job there with that?
No, absolutely. I mean, we know that for our heart, there's the pumping phase and then there's the filling phase. And the majority of the time we're in kind of like a filling, relaxed phase. And then pumping is like a third of the time.
Yeah.
And so, the mom is providing everything for her baby through the placenta. And the oxygen is coming to the baby through the placenta. And so if in a significant part of that baby's kind of heart and pumping and circulation, there isn't the ability to get oxygen from the placenta because the placenta has the dysfunction to prevent the blood from coming to get oxygen during a significant portion of the time, then that's going to create problems. And you know this, you work out, but not everybody knows this. Everything grows because of oxygen. Oxygen is the breath of life. So oxygen is one of the key nutrients that makes or breaks all kinds of things in terms of the fetal world and fetal development. And so if you're struggling to get sufficient oxygen to your body, you're going to compromise something. If you can't grow well because you're not getting the oxygen to grow your muscles and to grow your body, then you're going to make compromises. And so maybe I'm not going to be as big as I would have otherwise been because I'm under hardship in this situation. I'm struggling to make ends meet. And so I got to do the best I can with this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. This is a really tricky, this is where we really do rely on clinical specialists like yourself, because sometimes it's really hard to determine if a baby is fine or not fine. And like you said, if the baby's in a reasonable, like around normal in growth, if it's below 10th percentile, of course we can start splitting hairs, but fluid looks good. The baby's got all this great movement and everything. One thing I always tell people, Dr. K, and you're welcome to comment on this, is I care more about how your baby has grown from start to finish than a an individual measurement in one point in time, because number one, the margin of error, especially in the third trimester, you and I both know, is pretty darn, it can be sticky there. I mean, we can have a pretty
Yeah.
big difference in different people, whoever's holding the probe.
Yeah.
But also, if your baby was growing 50th percentile and now suddenly is in the 5th percentile, there's something going on. So let's start utilizing some of these tools. I think that's always my favorite reason to refer to an MFM, because you guys are like, you're the doctor and the ultrasound tech combined, and you have all these other special gifts to what you bring. So, man, we have covered a lot of ground. Thank you for all of that, by the way. And the one final question is related to, how have these changing abortion laws really altered the way that you're able to counsel women? Are you in the state of Michigan? Do I have that?
No, I work in Illinois.
Oh, in Illinois. Okay.
I live in
Gotcha.
Missouri, and I work in Illinois.
Oh, perfect. You're probably paying way better taxes in Missouri. I'll just say that. So how is this changing landscape around abortion and pro-choice versus pro-life and all of this? How is it impacting your practice to counsel around non-viable diagnoses that are, I mean, that's a separate conversation altogether for reasons we got into earlier, but how is it changing? How have you been able to navigate that as an MFM?
Well, interesting, Illinois hasn't changed that much. So I've been working in Illinois for the last 2 years. Prior to that, I was working in Missouri and working for a Jesuit Catholic program, which that those programs have their own limitations on access to certain things. So for me currently, I haven't seen a lot of difficulty because Illinois is not one of those places that has put in place some strict abortion bans. And I do know that people are moving and crossing state lines if they have the funds to do certain things, if they have the health stability to do that. And Illinois, I think, is one of the places that people might come to as well because of what are the neighboring states and the rules in some of the neighboring states. But I am concerned. I'm very concerned. As a high risk provider, we see all kinds of situations where you only even other medical providers don't always understand how complex things can go. It's very niche, and it's wildly inappropriate for the government to be putting limits on what a person can do in their body without understanding anything at all in terms of how that puts people's lives at risk. There's nothing on the back end to support those families for the things that come with the limitations the government has imposed on them. I think that these are very complex situations. My husband is my cheerleader. He used to be a cheerleader. he's my cheerleader, and he always advocates and talks when people think they know what I do. He's like, you have no idea what my wife does. You have no idea some of the things that the shit she sees. You have no idea the complications that can come up. And he's like, she's like the Navy SEAL of like, like,
damn right.
And I remember, I'm a person who follows Jesus, and I remember I had a very complicated situation where I was essentially doing like heroic measures to try and help this family keep their child, and I asked some people to pray for me. And when I kind of talked through the scenario, their eyes were like, "What?" They're like, I'm like, "Yeah, this baby might come like 17 weeks before its due date. Like if we can't help, they're not going to take a baby
Oh
home."
yeah.
Like, and they were like, "These things happen." Like people don't know, they don't know that pregnant women can look healthy, 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 and then just die if they cross over into severe sepsis, that they look really good because they're younger. And then, but if you tip them too far, you're so behind in trying to help them that you might lose moms waiting for them to be in severe sepsis before, and for their
Mm,
fetus to die before you offer them options in a
yeah.
pregnancy where the baby was never going to survive that without their mom, right? And so if you don't work in obstetrics, you don't work in high risk, you don't see these very complicated scenarios, you have no business putting
Yeah.
laws in place over that. You
Yeah.
just don't. And it doesn't stop abortion rates. It just moves abortions to other states. It doesn't, like, people that have the means to try and work within their community to get an abortion, if that's what they really want to do, they're just relocating, or they're getting medication and learning how to do it, on their own early on, or they're going on road trips with their friends. They're not announcing their, like, all the states that don't have strict abortion laws have seen an uptick in abortions being requested and performed by people who don't live in the state. And so our numbers of abortions across the country has gone up. So clearly this was not the answer. And all of us who knew or had any studied the topic at all knew it was never going to be the answer.
Of course. Yeah.
But there are people that refuse to, they just refuse for there to be any other answer than criminalization and being intrusive in the lives of women and families, for whatever their end goal is of that. But
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
at all costs, it doesn't,
Yeah. I'm totally with you. The going back to what you said is like the Navy SEAL of obstetrics. To see, like, I don't think people appreciate just how we've used words like complicated and whatever the stuff that you've seen in all this, but it's like you have to go to work every single day and to try your very best with an already difficult set of circumstances in many cases. For example, friends of ours, they tried for years and years and years to get pregnant, and then they got pregnant, and we were pregnant together, and it was amazing. And then they had to call us and tell us, we just got some bad news. It's 19 weeks. There's no brain developing. So they went for the same day. They were anencephaly, guys. There's no brain development. The baby's skull actually doesn't even form. It's this open cavity. And so there's a brain stem which can keep a little baby alive for a little bit, but this was like club feet. There was a heart defect. There was some big problems here. So sure enough, they went for an amnio. Do you have any idea what the diagnosis was? Pretty common, relatively common.
I mean, it could have no significant genetic defects, because
It was an aneuploidy.
yeah. So it could be triploidy, or it could be, but a lot of times it's amniotic bands. But I don't know. I'll let you tell.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that, but I just thought maybe it was coming to you. Trisomy 18 is Edwards syndrome, and not every trisomy 18 presents in the same way, but this is going to be very, very hard. I don't want to say it's going nowhere fast, because that is not my value system is not relevant. So they were counseled, and they decided they were going to terminate. I think it was like 19 or 20 weeks, and we're in a state, that abortion is really, really hard to find. You have to really, really work hard to find that. And this is a baby that would very likely have passed away before birth, in the uterus, and they would have had a stillbirth. And even if the baby did live, I, by the way, wrote a textbook chapter around a perinatal palliative care approach to trisomy 18. So this is like something I can speak on, at length. But ultimately they decided to terminate. And had they decided to go forth and to just see, let God take the wheel, however you want to frame it, that baby may have not even lived very long outside of the uterus. But this goes back to our original case where like this is so complex and it requires such a heart open space if we're going to do this thing that we set out to do as doctors, that to have now a policymaker that has no idea what Dr. K goes through on a daily basis.
They don't even
Not,
understand anencephaly. They think
yeah,
that I think we're doing like Greek mythology, which
yeah.
I think Greek mythology is centered on anomalies and like
the one that got stuck down in Hades. Like, is that what? No.
but like people can't even fathom some of these abnormalities. Like,
Yeah.
don't even have the imagination for how complex that scenario is. They've never
Yeah.
even seen it. They can't even they don't even know these things happen, and it the families that have to make those decisions, they should be the only ones making those decisions. And then the other part of it is there are always going to be providers that are not going to be keen on some of these things. So I kind of feel like it should just work itself out. There are going to be providers that say, you know what, ethically, morally, this is not something that I do.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's where it needs to be, at the clinician family level of saying, these are the options. I do this. I don't do this. Not like the states that are, I, as a person who follows Jesus, I am so vexed with hypocrisy that I see from people who also say they follow Jesus, and using the Bible that doesn't talk at all about abortion. I would love for somebody to give me one example in the Bible of abortion. There is not. Um, uh, and even in one of the few cases that even talks about the concept of pregnancy loss, it was like, if there was a scenario where if two men are fighting, two husbands are fighting, and the wife gets in the middle of the fight and loses a child, then that one husband owes the other husband money, right? It wasn't, I'm going to kill your other child because you killed mine. It was like, you pay me compensation for
That's
my
wild.
eye
Yeah.
for an eye. It was, okay, I suffered a loss and you owe me money for the loss of my child.
That is insane. Yeah.
Right? So the Bible does not outline these things, and people have reached and inserted all kinds of commentary to talk about when life begins, and honestly, it's like, whatever you think on it, fine, do it for you. But I have no business imposing my morality on someone else. Whatever, if that person believes in God, it's between them and God. If they don't believe in God, it's between them and whomever, whatever. Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want to do abortions, then don't do it for yourself.
Yeah.
I personally, I don't know that I would have an abortion for myself. But it's not, that's a decision for me. There's so many things that are unique to me. There are things that I would never do that other moms would do. I don't have a right putting my life and my value system on someone else who sees things differently, who's lived things differently.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just so wrong. And it's not the answer. And we're showing people again that it's not the answer, that when you just say we're going to criminalize and restrict access to abortion, then in fact, you're actually going to make abortion rates go up. But we know what the answers are. The answers are allow people to not get pregnant when they don't want to, but help people prevent unwanted pregnancies, help people have better finances, because the number one reason people have abortions, most abortions happen before 9 weeks of pregnancy, and then most of the time it's out of finances. Help people with their
why don't we do that alone? Let's like make our country a little more equal, given how freaking rich we are. Like,
expand
make
access
it
to
easy. Yeah.
health insurance and affordable health care. We've saw that when people had expanded access to affordable health care, abortion rates went down. It's not anti-abortion. Anti-abortion laws are not how you win. Like, we've been telling people that, but people don't. Some people don't want to listen.
Yeah.
And they don't believe that. They don't believe the data. They believe that we all just want to kill babies, um, and like I don't perform abortions.
Yeah.
Uh, but the data is out there. Like the
Yeah.
anti-abortion laws are not where you win on this topic. It's actually, it just makes things worse, and you make criminals and you devastate families. But it does
Yeah.
not. It is not where you decrease the abortion rate numbers. If that's your goal, that's not how you achieve it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's sort of like when people are like, "Come on, spanking kids isn't bad. It's they sometimes like they can take it. It makes them more resilient." And I'm like, okay, like I am not saying that when I was spanked as a kid that I was child abuse. However, as a parent, I'm not going to tell you what to do to your kids, but if you try spanking them, it doesn't work. Like you're just hurting them, it's hurting you. So you could keep pushing this agenda and rearranging the decks on the Titanic as your like relationship with your child sinks, but if it doesn't work, then
Yeah.
you need to come up with a more like impressive creative solution to this problem, because I don't care what you tried in the past, it just doesn't work. And that's I think what we see with abortion laws, which is really hard because it becomes so political, and race gets brought in, and then other things get brought in that like really aren't relevant to the fact that this is a human being that needs compassionate support, and they should be at the center of the conversation, period.
Yeah. And it's also about privacy and autonomy.
Yeah.
And so I understand the thought of, well, I personally do think it's hard to say when life begins. And I think that in general, once you conceive, there is a trajectory of life that is the goal most of the
Yeah.
time.
Oh yeah.
That's where it's
Like
going to go.
unstoppable. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Unless you stop it, that's where most of these scenarios are going to go. They're going to be those that end early, and that never achieve life. And I don't know when we become thoughtful human beings, or if when we have a soul and a spirit. Like there's where do you find that information? How do you know? Is it when you breathe, like, after you're born, or, because you're not breathing on your own when you're in the womb. You're completely a parasite, dependent on mom for everything. But keep your morality to yourself,
Yeah.
because if I'm not your parent and I'm not taking responsibility for you and all of the things that I impose on your life, then I have no business being involved in it.
That's right.
If I'm not taking care of you and your family after I force you to have this child, and all of what that does to your family and to our communities, and if I have not taken care of these unwanted children that are getting born and put into foster care or up for adoption or getting sex trafficked and smuggled
Yeah.
all over the world because their families did not want them, did not have the capacity to care for them. If I'm not providing the healthcare dollars for these children with permanent disability that are going to have long-term needs, they may not die from some of these things, but they're going to have long-term drain, on financial drain, emotional drain, then I have no business. If
Yeah.
I'm not there for the end, I have no business being involved in the middle of it.
Amen. Amen. Let's if we had I should have like a button where I can be like roaring applause or something, or like boo, or I don't know, but that's a roaring applause one there. That's amazing. Well, Dr. K, you're clearly passionate about this stuff, and if people,
mom's rights and autonomy, and yeah, I'm here for the moms and their families.
yeah. Yeah, well, good. You went into the right field for the right reasons, and I really respect and admire you. Your Instagram handle is DRK_pregnancy specialist, and I encourage everybody to go and check out your stuff. Maybe by the time people are hearing this, there will be some online programs that you can offer, but in the meantime, keep doing what you're doing, and thank you so much for giving me almost 2 hours of your time.
But thank you, Nathan. I was kind of nervous, but this has been so much fun.
I'm a pretty easygoing, easy to get along with person in real life.
I didn't think I was nervous about your personality. I was just like, what questions are you going to ask me? Because I know that some of I know that you have some unconventional ideas, which I think are awesome. I think we need to give more room for unconventional
Yeah.
ideas. And so it's like, how down the rabbit trail are we going to go? Like, how do I prep for
Well,
what he
that'll be part two. Part two, we'll go into some other weird territories that only somebody like you can really, pontificate on. So,
No, it's been a lot of fun.
thank you.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube. If anybody's interested to follow along with another unconventional high-risk OBGYN, putting content out there to empower moms.
Go get it. Go get it. We'll put everything in the podcast description. If you're listening or you're watching on YouTube, you'll see it all in the links just below this episode. Thank you, Dr. K.
Thank you.